What's up everybody, welcome back, and today we're going to be talking about a burning question that I've had on my mind for a few weeks now. Ever since the Shaddolls Showdown structure deck came out, I've been working on this deck, and every time I build a new version of it, I think to myself, how do we fix Shaddolls? I mean, in order to fix the deck, we have to acknowledge its first and major problem, that polymerization is crucial. If you can't fuse, you can't play the game. And as it stands in pure builds, only having 3 copies of El Shaddol Fusion and 3 copies of Shaddol Fusion just is not cutting it. We need access to other cards that give us fusion from hand specifically. Cards like Polymerization or Super Polymerization that fuse from board aren't going to do it, because most of the time we're going to need to fuse away cards out of our hand. Jumping into it, we're going to be starting off with how I'm going to be grading each of these options that I'm about to talk about. A being superb, best of the best. Definitely slap these in your deck. Unfortunately, the A-class stuff typically comes with a little bit heftier of a price tag. B, better than most, definitely worth playing. C, solid, but there's probably better options you could play. D, not really worth your time. F is relegated only to that one player at your locals who throws out random stuff at you, like playing Perform Pal Trump Witch to tribute it so you can search a poly, when you could just be playing a card like King of the Swamp, or even the Lunalite card that searches Polymerization instead. And then plus or minus to denote when a card, it might be closer to the upper tier or lower tier of that specific tier. Solution 1, I think, is no surprise to anyone. It's Invoked. This entire engine's really fantastic with Shaddolls. This has really proved itself. I don't want to talk about it too much. It gives you access to Mechaba. It gives you essentially access to 9 to 10 additional copies of Polymerization through Alistair the Invoker, searching out Invocation, or just opening Invocation. So overall, Invoked, its final rank is an A. I don't think that's really up for debate. The amount of flexibility that this entire engine gives dolls is almost unquestioning. And I didn't really want to focus on it too much for this video. Jumping into our first real option though, we have our second solution, Keeper of Dragon Magic. This card reads, if this card is normal summoned or special summoned, you can discard 1 card, add 1 Polymerization normal spell or fusion normal spell from your deck to your hand. You can reveal 1 fusion monster, enter your deck, special summon 1 fusion materials whose name is specifically listed on the monster from your graveyard in face down defense position, and you can only use each effect once per turn, and you can only summon fusion monsters that turn. So the first part of the effect is really what we're focusing on here, because an on-summon effect that adds Polymerization to a hand is pretty strong. And going over the other pros, it has no real engine requirements. It can search out Shaddol Fusion. It can be used multiple times. It can be reused off of a card like Cross Sheep, for example. If it's special summoned back, its effect will trigger again. And it, like I said, it has that on summon effect. However, it has some pretty hefty cons. The first one being that discard is cost, which is really unfortunate because it doesn't trigger our Shaddol effects. It means it can be ashed. It uses up your normal summon, so you can't play other cards like Mathematician and this card, because otherwise you might clog on normal summons in your hand. And you can't use both effects to their fullest. There might be other decks that take advantage of Keeper of Dragon Magic a little more than Shaddolls can, especially post Master Rule 5, when their fusion monsters are no longer locked to needing links to be summoned. But right now, the requirements for it are a little too hefty. The discarding for cost is a little too hefty. So overall, I think I'm comfortable giving Keeper of Dragon Magic a C in terms of ranking. Realistically, this card only adds 3 to 4 additional copies of Polymerization to your deck in the forms of him being 3 copies, as well as if you want to play an additional card or additional copy of Polymerization to up those numbers. Continuing on to our next one, we have Fusion Recycling Plant. I honestly think this is really cool because it says once per turn, you can discard 1 card, add 1 Polymerization from your deck or graveyard to your hand, and once per turn during your end phase, you can target 1 monster in your graveyard that was used as a fusion material for a fusion summon this turn, add it to your hand. So jumping into the pros for this card, it searches a poly every single turn, adds it back from graveyard every single turn, so you're never going to be hurting for fusion spells if you're playing this card. Adds back from grave, which is a huge plus. Lets you recycle your resources every single turn, and if you use a card like Super Polymerization, fuse away one of your own cards, or El Shaddol Fusion during your opponent's turn, you can actually recur an additional piece of advantage every single turn, on your turn and on your opponent's turn, which really helps the drawback of fusion. And since we're already playing Shaddolls, a deck that pluses off of its fusion summon, having a card that's going to give us an additional plus each turn is really nice. So for the cons, again, it's hard because it's a discard for cost. If this card gets negated right after you discard, that feels pretty bad. It can be removed relatively easily because it is a field spell card. There's a lot of ways to remove it. And it falls prey to most of the Ghost Girl's effects. Ash Blossom stops it cold. Even if you're choosing them from graveyard and you only have one in graveyard, Ash can negate it. Bell can always negate it. And Ogre can destroy it, like it said in the previous point. It's easily removed. However, it's pretty strong overall, so I think it warrants at least a B ranking. Mostly because you don't have to play any other cards besides Polymerization in your deck and this card. You can keep your count on this relatively low. Like you can play like a 3-2 split on Polymerizations. You could even get away with like a 3-1 split. Or alternatively, you could do like a 2-1 split. I know that a person in Australia topped with that. With this specific engine in their deck, which is really strong. Unfortunately, that means we're only adding 3 additional copies of Polymerization to our deck, which means we're only bringing our poly total up to 9, which is not quite where we want it to be. The gold standard, like Invoked being at about 15 copies of Polymerization in the deck, means that you have about a 95% chance to open it. When we start getting below 10, we start getting into about the 70-ish% range for drawing fusion, which can be a little rough. We might want something a little more consistent than this. Continuing on, we have the Predaplant engine. Now, this engine is really powerful. Starting off with Orphis Scorpio, it has the effect that if this card is normal or special summon, you can send one monster from your hand to the graveyard, special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck, and you can only use its effect once per turn. And then what you're always going to be summoning, this is a 3-1 engine of 3 Orphis Scorpio, 1 Cobra, is Predaplant Darlington Cobra. If this card is special summoned by the effect of a Predaplant, you can add 1 Polymerization spell card or fusion spell card from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect once per duel. And as I'm sure you guys have seen, this card is incredibly powerful. This searches any fusion spell, including Super Polymerization, which is pretty crazy. For the cost of 1 discard, it also puts an additional monster on the field, which means that you can make a Link 2 Link 2 play for free. Like you can take this, immediately go into your Cross Sheep, and then fusion summon under a Cross Sheep right away. Or alternatively, once what's it called? Predaplant, Verdant, Anaconda comes out. That card is also really strong to go in with 2 monsters. It gives you a couple more fusion plays for your turn. And also another really strong point to add here is that Orphis Scorpio gets its effect when it's special summoned. So you can play a card like Lone Fire Blossom in your deck to summon out the Orphis Scorpio. So theoretically, you can play up to 6 copies of Scorpio, which is really, really cool because it means that we've upped our poly count at that point to about 12 if we're saying 3 Orphis Scorpio, 3 Lone Fire Blossom, 3 Shaddolls Fusion, 3 Shaddolls Fusion. Unfortunately, this engine comes with some pretty hefty cons. The discard for cost explicitly has to be a monster, which can be a little bit rough at times. So like if you open Orphis Scorpio and a handful of spells, this card is dead. And it's a dead draw after the first time you use it, unlike the other things that we've looked at. The other engines can be used multiple times a duel. Orphis Scorpio is really a one and done, get you off the ground. Hopefully it was good enough to get you going. And it really, really feels bad if you draw this Darlingtonian Cobra. Like this card is actually atrocious to draw. If you draw any amount of Scorpio next to a Cobra, all the cards in your hand are basically just dead. And honestly, that is enough for me to take away from the overall power that it gives your deck for that lack of like that. Even though it's only like about a 3% chance, something like that, 3 to 5% chance to draw a 1 of in your deck, I have to give this engine a B-. The consistency factors aren't going to do you well across a long day, especially since Shaddolls are already kind of inconsistent. We don't want to add an engine that's going to make it a little more inconsistent, especially since Shaddolls grinds very well throughout the course of a game. Like it has a good chance to grind out other decks, and having 6 of a card that's dead after dead after your first use of 1, so you have 5 additional copies after that, seems like not really worth the trade-off to get you started in the first place, when there's some other valuable options we can play over this that will also do about the same thing, just to a little bit lower of a power, or a little bit lower of a power level. And some honorable mentions before we move into what I personally think is like the best budget option outside of Invoked. We have King of the Swamp, discard this card, add Polymerization from your deck to your hand. Allows you to run more than 3 copies of Polymerization, allows you to deck thin, meaning you're going to be able to draw into your fusion spells more often, which is really cool. We're confirmed to get Predaplant, Verte, Anaconda now. That was just announced for Dual Overload, so this card is also a really strong option for your deck building for Shaddolls. However, it does require you to already have been able to put 2 monsters on the board, so it doesn't really fix the problem. You could also alternatively play just 3 copies of Polymerization. You need a C fusion spell. Polymerization is a fusion spell that allows you to fuse from hand or field, so honestly really good. Or alternatively, you could also play a card like Magicalized Fusion, which is essentially the Overload Fusion but for spellcasters. So like say you get off the ground but your opponent DD Crows your fusion spell, you can Magicalized Fusion, and it's essentially like another copy, or it's essentially like Shaddolls Fusion from deck, because it allows you to put another construct on the board for free without having to use any of your other resources. Construct dumps a fusion spell, and then you link off the construct into something else, and you're back in business. You have access to your fusion spells again. So I definitely think it's worth considering playing, but I don't think it's super strong. I think, like I said, there's other stronger options you could play, and my personal favorite engine for this deck that you can add is Heroes. Oh my gosh, I've been gushing over this with my buddies. Shout out to my boy, my resident hero player, who mentioned that Vion searches Polymerization. I was like, oh yeah, it does, that's pretty good. And then we thought about it more, and the implications here are great. But starting off with the effect, we have Vision Hero Vion. If this card is normal or special summon, you can send 1 hero monster from your deck to the graveyard. You can only use the effect of Vision Hero Vion once per turn. Once per turn, you can banish 1 hero monster from your graveyard, add 1 poly from your deck to your hand. So it dumps a hero, and then with that hero you just dumped, you banish it to search a Polymerization. And then the next key card in this combo is Elemental Hero Shadow Mist. If this card is special summon, you can add 1 change, quick play spell card from your deck to your hand. But its more important effect is if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add 1 hero monster from your deck to your hand, except Elemental Hero Shadow Mist, and you can only use 1 effect per turn. So we Vion dump Shadow Mist. Shadow Mist searches you, in this example, Elemental Hero Neost, or Honest Neost, and then you banish the Shadow Mist with your Vion effect to add Polymerization from your deck to your hand, and at that point you have both a Polymerization, you have a light card, and all of this was off of 1 normal summon. So now honestly this card is pretty great for the fact that it allows Shaddolls to start branching out into 2 card combos. Like this is actually almost exactly what I think the deck was missing. Has a little bit of consistency issues, which we'll touch on in a second, but like I said, it searches that poly that you really need to get off the ground turn 1. It searches the light that you need to get off the ground turn 1. It is a normal summon out to a lot of problem cards, because you Vision Hero, dump Shadow Mist. Shadow Mist is going to search your Elemental Hero Neos, or Honest Neos, and then when you can go into battle phase with your Vion to attack over an Avermax, attack over a Naturia Beast, attack over a Fossil Dyna by using your Elemental Hero Honest Neos to boost him up to 3,500. So like a 3,500 normal summon is pretty potent and is a great tool for this deck to have. Also, a really cool option that you have is that if you already open a really strong hand, you could gain access to Dark Law with this deck, because you're able to, instead of using the Shadow Mist effect to search, instead of using the Vion to banish the Shadow Mist to search Polymerization, midway through a sequence you can summon back your Shadow Mist with Cross Sheep to get its effect to search for a Mass Change or a Mass Change 2, and that way you can make Dark Law on your opponent's turn on top of the already busted Shaddolls combo that you can do, ending on Avermax or Appaloosa plus a Winda. It's very, very difficult to out. I'll be showcasing that a little bit later this week, so stay tuned for that. And what's even better, this card doesn't discard for cost like almost every other thing on this list. This is one of the very few options that just raw will search you a Polymerization for essentially no cost. Another card to consider here is you could also play Elemental Hero Blazeman, because on normal summon, Blazeman will just search a Polymerization from your deck to your hand. However, I think the power that Vion has, adding an additional light, edges out playing Blazeman overall. And then for the cons, it does add garnets to your deck. Opening the Honest Neos is fine, because when you dump Shadow Mist, you can just search an additional copy of Vion. So in that regard, opening that is okay. The bigger problem is in hands where you open Shadow Mist, you don't really have a card to dump off of Vion, but you can still dump the Honest Neos to banish it to get the poly. So even in that case, as long as you don't open both your Honest Neos, your Shadow Mist, and a Vion, it should for the most part be okay. Like you still have good options even in those cases where you see them. And at some point during the turn, if you were to fuse away the Shadow Mist out of your hand, you're going to get Shadow Mist's effect to search out a Polymerize, or search out another copy of Vion. So even when you open your bricks, you still are getting your +1s essentially for free off of all of these cards. Like, no matter what, these cards are going to net you advantage. And because of that, these cards seem to do everything in all situations, and they seem to slot in exactly to what I think Shaddolls needed the most, I'm giving this engine a B+. I think it's definitely better than the Fusion Recycling Plant in regards to the fact that this adds a lot of power to your deck while also adding a lot of consistency. Because Vion is a hero card, or is a warrior monster, we get to play a card like E-Call, giving us another additional copy of Vion. And with playing 3 copies of Vion, that essentially adds like 4 copies of Polymerization to your deck. And then depending on how many Polymerizations you want to have, like, I think in my personal opinion, having 2 copies would be good, because it means that you can draw 1 and still get really good value off of your Vion effect. And Poly is just good overall. You can add like essentially 6 copies of Polymerization to your deck without really lowering the consistency at all. In fact, probably boosting it to a good amount. And I think it definitely outclasses the Orphis Scorpio engine in that regard as well, because this engine is much safer. There's no discard, so there's no chance of, like, if you get hand trapped, it's not nearly as bad for you. And like I said, I think this engine's really cool. I've been labbing it up with my boys, trying to think of a good deck that I could showcase to all of you. And I think we're in a place where we're close, but not quite. Needs a little bit more testing. But with that being said, appreciate you guys watching this video. Let me know what you guys have been testing. Let me know if there's like some broken engine that you guys have been testing out that I didn't mention here. Fusion cards are a little bit awkward, you know, they require a lot to get going. Fusion has a lot of support. There's a very good chance that I overlooked some like niche tech card that might be worth playing. That being said, this has been Underclocked here. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.